Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, hello, my name is Grizel, and in today's video we are going to be talking about the story that has inspired many adaptations, including the 1953 Disney animated film Peter Pan. We will also be looking a little bit into the actual story of the author J.M. Barrie. So if that's something that you are interested in, then keep on watching. The movie begins by introducing us to the darling children. Wendy is the oldest, followed by John and Michael. One night while their parents were at a party, Peter sneaks into their room looking for his shadow. The children didn't fear Peter as they had heard of him in many stories before. Peter teaches the children how to fly, and off they go to Neverland. Once in Neverland, we meet the Lost Boys and Peter's all-time enemy, Captain Hook. In the beginning, the children are having a wonderful time, but soon they are captured by Indians and not very well received by the mermaids. The children begin to miss their family and decide it's time to return home. However, before they make it out of Neverland, they are captured by Captain Hook, who is soon defeated by Peter and fed to a crocodile. Peter then saves the children, enchants the ship with fairy dust, and flies away, returning the children back to their family. Now, Disney did a really good job at removing the sinister undertone of the book because although the story is very similar, they did leave out very important details. So who exactly is Peter Pan? Because when the story begins, we're told that Peter is the only child that will never grow up. However, we know that all children grow up, including the Lost Boys. So this makes me believe, is it possible that maybe Peter is not alive? And if so, is he aware that he isn't? In the book, Peter tells Wendy that he ran away from home the day he was born because he overheard his mom and dad speaking of what he would become when he grew up to be an adult. And he didn't like what he heard, so he decided he didn't want to ever grow up and he wanted to instead remain a small boy forever. Another reason I believe it's a possibility that Peter is indeed not alive is because in a part of the story it says there were rumors that Peter often led dead children halfway so that they wouldn't be scared. So my thought is, he led them halfway where? And why does he see these dead children? So while the movie wants us to believe that Peter occasionally flies to the darling children's house, sits outside their window to listen to the stories that Wendy is telling her younger brothers, in the book it actually tells us that Peter visits the darling children at night, goes inside their room, sits on their beds, and pretty much watches them. I don't know about you, but for me, the thought alone of having something or someone fly into my bedroom at night and sit on my bed to watch me kind of creeps me out. So contrary to what the movie makes us believe, the flight to Neverland actually lasted several days. And during the flight, Wendy learns that Peter actually has terrible memory and he often needs constant reminders of who the children are. It also tells us that during the travel there, the kids were often cold and then hot and hungry and sleepy, but they couldn't fall asleep because unlike Peter, who was able to levitate, if they are to fall asleep, they just fall to their death. So often during the flight, Wendy is watching how her brothers are falling asleep and just free falling down, and just before they strike the sea, Peter will dip down and rescue them. But for Peter, this was just more like a game. So Wendy was fearful that at any point, Peter would just become bored with this game of rescuing the kids and pretty much just let them fall and die. So in the movie, we see the Lost Boys, who are described by Peter as his men. And for the Lost Boys, Peter is pretty much like their captain. So basically in the story, these are kids who pretty much is children who strayed away from their family and Peter took them with him. I don't know, but that's kind of creepy. It's like he's like an abductor. So regardless of how they get to Neverland, the truth is that the Lost Boys are in fact scared of Peter. It's mentioned that they try really hard not to get Peter upset because when Peter does get upset, he often feeds them imaginary food, and he's even said to have killed some of the Lost Boys. So in the book, it tells us that The boys on the island vary, of course, in numbers, according to as they get killed and so on. And when they seem to be growing up, which is against the rules, Peter thins them out. Because the truth of the matter is, Peter absolutely hates adults. And as the kids get older, because remember, Peter is the only one who doesn't age in Neverland, he pretty much gets rid of them. So in the book, we come to realize that Peter absolutely hates adults. And this becomes more evident when Wendy tells Peter that they have decided to return home, because at this point, Wendy really misses her mom and dad, and her brothers have begun to forget their family. So Wendy is like telling the Lost Boys about how amazing and how wonderful her mother is, and is pretty much offering the Lost Boys the opportunity to come back home with her and her brothers so that they can as well have a mother and a father. To which Peter agrees, but not before trying to convince them and to tell them that indeed they're wrong and that mothers aren't exactly as wonderful as Wendy wants them to believe they are. In the book it reads, "Long ago, I thought like you that my mother would always keep the window open for me. So I stayed away for moons and moons and moons and then flew back. But the window was barred. My mother had forgotten all about me, and there was another little boy sleeping in my bed." We also know that although Peter wanted them to believe that he didn't care, he actually did care a lot, because after he agreed to Wendy and the Lost Boys and her brothers to go back home, he went inside his tree and he started to hyperventilate. Now he did this because there was a saying in Neverland that every time you breathe, a grown-up dies. So when they're on the way back home, Peter tells Tinkerbell to go ahead of them so that she can go ahead and put the bars on Wendy's window, because Peter wanted for Wendy to see those bars and to think that her parents didn't want them anymore. But when Peter arrived to Wendy's window, he saw on the inside Wendy's mother crying and very distraught for having lost all three of her children. So although he was pretty much having like an internal battle with himself to where he didn't want to do the right thing, he ends up deciding he won't put the bars up and he will let Wendy return, because he just saw how much Wendy's mother was suffering. And to me, this is the pretty much only or maybe first time that we see a little bit of compassion in Peter. I think in this moment, he remembers that time when he arrived to his home and when he saw his mom with another child. So that is where the movie ends. However, in the book, we know that Peter ends up making a deal with Mrs. Darling to where every year around spring, he is going to pick up Wendy and take her with him to Neverland for, I think it's a period of a week. And during this week, she's going to do spring cleaning and act like his mom. But we know that Peter and the conception of time are kind of off. So for Peter, although he says it's gonna be every year, Peter doesn't really have this notion of what exactly a year is. So we know that he comes back the next year and he takes her, but then after that, he kind of stops coming. Like he never goes back. And by then Wendy grows up and she becomes an adult. She gets married. She has a daughter of her own. And one day Peter comes back to her house and he thinks that he is going to still see Wendy as the little girl, because for him only 1 year has passed and he hasn't realized that tons of years have passed and that Wendy is now an adult. So when he gets there and she tells him like, hey Peter, I'm not a little girl anymore, I grew up, he gets really, really angry, because to him, he thought that she had agreed she wasn't gonna grow up, but she explains to him that it's impossible for her not to grow up. So he just has to accept that Wendy is no longer a little girl and that all this time has passed. But he does see that Wendy now has a daughter called Jane. So he tells Wendy that since she can't come to Neverland and do the spring cleaning and act as his mother for a week, that he is then going to take her daughter Jane, which Wendy at first is like, no, don't take her, because creepy. In the book, he takes Jane with him and he continues to go back to take Jane with him throughout the years until then Jane grows up and she eventually has a daughter as well, and then Peter goes back and takes the daughter. So he pretty much keeps taking these girls one after the other. Like, it's just It's just completely creepy. So that is where the story ends. However, that is not where this video ends, because I also wanted to include a little bit about the author of the book, because even his story is a little sad and a little creepy. But basically, James Barrie was 6 years old when his older brother David, who was 2 days away from turning 14, passed away from a really crazy ice skating accident. And it said that David was his mom's favorite child. So when David passed away, his mom was really distraught, and James, in trying to make his mom feel better, would often like wear his dead brother's clothes and try to like whistle the same melodies that his brother would, so that his mom would feel like David was still there and maybe cheer up. It's also said that one time he entered her room and she asked if it was David, and he told her no, that it was him. And she always told James that she found comfort in knowing that David would always be a child and that he would never grow up, because he had passed away as a child. And this is also one of the things that people say inspired James to write the story Peter Pan. So eventually James does, grow older, and he gets married, although it's said that his marriage was unconsummated. They also never had any children of their own. But it's said that James would often take like his dog for strolls around Kensington Garden, and he would often befriend the children that were there playing, and that he would go really often, and he was very friendly to a lot of these children. Now, at one point, he makes friends with the Davies, who were, I think it was 5 of them in total, but James had a really good relationship with the 3 youngest, which also helped inspire the story of Peter Pan. But he makes friends with these kids, and he would then go even more often to the Kensington Gardens to play with them and to spend time with them. And I don't know, kind of weird, but okay. So eventually he ends up like befriending the actual family as a whole, and he becomes like friends with the kids' moms and their dad, and they like do like outings and everything, and the kids start referring to James as Uncle Jim. As a mom, I don't know how I would feel about some stranger like befriending my 9-year-old at the park and then wanting to spend like time with them and coming to my house. I would find it a little bit odd. Eventually, the father of the family passes away. James really steps up to the plate, and he starts to become like the provider for the kids. It doesn't mention when, but at some point he does get like divorced. So he ends up spending a lot of time with the children and with the kid's mother. And years pass, and the kid's mom passed away. And in her will, which she says like she wanted the kids to be cared for by their nana and by the nana's sister, whose name was Jenny. But it said that when James did the unofficial copying of the will, he switched the name Jenny to the name Jimmy, which is how the mom would refer to him, so that he was able to get custody of the kids this way. So he has this relationship with the kids, and he pretty much raises these kids. And it said that prior to befriending the Davies kids, and after the kids already grow up, he also has like, he made friends with other children. So prior to the Davies, he had like other kid friends, and then he had the Davies, and then once they grew up, he kept like befriending small children. Pretty much people just say like he was a really cool dude, but I mean, it doesn't take away the whole creepy aspect of old adults looking to be friends with small children. But before James passed away, he did do something that was absolutely amazing. He did leave the copyright of Peter Pan to the Great Ormond Street Hospital in the UK. So that hospital has been able to benefit owning that copyright throughout all these years. So overall, that's what I have for this story. It's, it's been all over the place, but it was really interesting. I had a lot of fun looking into it, and I learned a lot, because you always see these movies and you kind of just pretty much like just brush through what the movie is showing you. But looking into this in detail, it was really, really interesting to see where this all came up. So hopefully you liked this video. If you did, please leave me a thumbs up. Leave a comment below. If there's any other ones that you think I should look into, go ahead and leave it in the comment section. And again, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. It does help me a lot. And I will see you in my next video.